Good morning, Dobry dzień. I've been given the task of telling you a little bit about Košice, which is a bit strange because those of you who know me know I'm not Slovakian. I can only claim that my great-grandmother was from Bratislava, and the rest of my family originated in Russia. But this year I'll have spent more time working in the city here than I will in my hometown of Cambridge. So I'm going to give you my view of the city, the region, and the country, clearly subjective. Some of what I'm going to say, those of you that are Slovakian, and especially from the city, will already know, so apologies if I'm telling you things that you're already aware of. But for some of you, this is probably the first time in the city, and maybe even the first time in Slovakia. So as this conference is called Place, I'd like to give you my impressions and thoughts on the country, on the region, on the city, its history, its economy, and most importantly, its people. Clearly an outsider's view, but it is based on having worked here for the past 3 years. After that, I want to describe a bit and comment on what I see as the main challenges and opportunities for the city and the region, for its development and specifically for its cultural development. Explain to you some of what's happening now in this particular year, and in my view, what's still to be done. So this will be informed, as I said, by my work in the city. So what am I doing at the moment? Well, I'm currently involved in 2 developmental projects, one for audience development, one for professional development. And last year, with Tom and Michal and Vladimir Kemet, we produced the Creative Economy Masterplan. And this year, Michal and I are working on producing a cultural strategy for the years 2014 to 2019. And from the Creative Economy Masterplan came the establishment of the Creative Economy Institute, which is the host of this conference. But let's start with where we actually are. So we're now located just 90 kilometers from Poland, 80 from the Ukraine, and just 25 from Hungary. But Bratislava is 400 kilometers to the west. And it takes 5 hours to get there by car or by train. So we're very much in the east. And understanding the region and the city's geography and its history, I feel, is really critical to understanding it. You're also in a predominantly rural area, a very beautiful rural area, surrounded by nature, national parks, and for those of you visiting, if you've got time to go out, I really recommend it, and particularly visiting the amazing underground cave network that is in this area. The city has about 250,000 inhabitants, and the region about 800,000, out of a total population of 5.4 million for the whole country. In Košice, there are 3 universities with nearly 30,000 students, the largest being the Technical University, but they're predominantly science rather than arts-based, and I'm told that the art department of the Technical University has just under 500 people. Very important people, but not so many. And there you can study architecture, design, fine art, new media, and art history. But at the moment, you can't study theatre, you can't study music, dance, or film. And as with many other countries, Slovakia has suffered from the European financial crisis, and unemployment here is currently running at about 14%. And that's for the country, but actually it's also for the city. But in the region, there's higher unemployment, which goes between 18 to 20%. But one piece of good news is I saw on the Slovak Statistical Office website recently that in the city, unemployment's been coming down month on month this year. Tom mentioned the issue about retaining talent, and that is an issue here, that people, and particularly young people, are leaving this region in too large numbers, either to study or to work elsewhere, and many of them unfortunately do not return. Some go to Bratislava, but also further afield to Prague, to Austria, to Berlin, other parts of Europe, and even further afield. There's also an east-west divide in this country that I've seen, and a very strong rivalry between Bratislava and Košice. So there is a brain drain here, and it's the case that you get this brain drain with so many smaller countries. And it's partly due to the capital city here really being the centre of so much and offering the widest range and volume of work, career, leisure and educational opportunities. Another statistic I pulled out was that 38% of the economically active population in the Košice area still look for jobs outside of the region. So it's essential for Košice not only to halt this brain drain, but to also attract people to come back and new people to come in, live and work here. So as well as providing jobs, which is critical, it also means good quality services, recreation, culture, housing, education, and improved national and international transportation links. Mr. Mayor, I'm happier than you can ever imagine that for the first time in 3 years, I flew directly from Luton to Košice on Tuesday. So thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Visit Košice, who are also critical. But, Mr. Mayor, my wife wanted me to tell you she's very unhappy with you because as a result of now being able to fly directly here, I won't be spending 4 to 6 hours in Bratislava, Prague, Vienna or Budapest airports, where I was always buying her presents in the duty-free shop. So, identity, I think, is also an issue here, both national and regional. Also, awareness. I feel that there is a lack of international awareness still and recognition of the country and of the city, even with the capital of culture. And the reality is that most people outside of East and Central Europe have not really heard of Košice, and some would find it hard to point out where Slovakia is on a map of Europe. And often when I tell people I'm coming to Slovakia, they say, hey, great, I heard that Ljubljana is a really cool city. But I think that's also an opportunity. And it's kind of like, I think Slovakia is one of the best kept secrets in Europe. And my 2 daughters are in their early 20s, seem to be spending most of my money in the last 2 years visiting music festivals all over Europe. This year, one of them was in Barcelona, another was in an island in Croatia. And before I came here, I was explaining to one of my daughters about this conference, and she said, hey, you've got to tell them it's really cool to have music festivals in places no one's heard of. Yeah? DJs and young people really like this. So people want to come to places they haven't been to before. Everyone goes to Prague, everyone goes to Rome, etc., etc. So I think there's a real opportunity there from the tourism perspective. In terms of history, what can be truly called an independent Slovakian state has only ever existed for 20 years, since 1993. And it's actually the 3rd youngest country in the world still in terms of achieving its national sovereignty. So it's a very new country, and it's still, I feel, developing its own sense of being, identity and confidence. And Tom mentioned confidence. And I have to say that with some people I've met in the culture sector, there is a lack of self-confidence. And they don't believe that they're good enough to present their work or to work outside of Slovakia, which of course is not the case. Demographically, Košice's past and present is not just Slovak. Its inhabitants have included Hungarians, Roma, Jews, Poles, Germans, etc. It's had 10 different names and 6 different languages in its 800-year written history, and was mainly ruled by the Hungarians and then Austro-Hungarians up to the end of the First World War, when it first became Czechoslovakia. And in 1938, before the Second World War, the Hungarians came back and were running this part of Slovakia, while the rest of the country was a fascist puppet regime, really under the Nazis. And so before the Holocaust, Košice was home to one of the largest and most important Jewish communities in Slovakia. In 1930, there were 11,500 Jews in the city, which was 16% of the city's population. And there are still 4 wonderful synagogues in the city and a Jewish cemetery. And one of the synagogues is the home of the Philharmonic Orchestra. And for the past 2 years, there's been a Jewish festival here called Mazel Tov, which has been very, very popular. At the end of the Second World War, a lot of Hungarians, about 80,000, were forced to leave Slovakia, and there's still some tension around this. In Košice, 11% of the population inhabitants in the region are of Hungarian origin, and 4% are Roma. And the city has a Hungarian and a Roma theatre, which are owned by the region. So in terms of the Roma, quite often when you Google Košice, comes up with the Roma community here. And it isn't clear how many Roma exactly there are in Slovakia. Some say it might be as high as 5%. But the relationship between the Roma communities and Slovakians is challenging, and it's difficult, and continues to be so, and it's a real social issue. And unfortunately, this August, a local mayor erected an illegal wall here in one of the districts. They have district mayors here, and this was illegal, and the European Commission got involved, and the mayor basically has taken legal action to have this wall removed. But dealing with ethnic minorities, and again Tom mentioned this, I think is a key issue. It can't just be put under the carpet and ignored. I think there needs to be work done on this. It's very difficult, but I think one needs to try. So then after the Second World War, Czechoslovakia was reconstituted, and in 1969 became a federation. But many of my Slovak friends have told me that when there was the so-called velvet divorce of Czechoslovakia into the Czech Republic and Slovak republics in 1992, if there'd been a national referendum, then the majority of people would have voted to keep the federation. Whether that's true or not, I have no idea. Well, let's look at the economy now. So Košice has been dominated by its steelworks, which caused the city to grow from 60,000 people in 1950 to 235,000 in 1991. And at its peak, it employed some 30,000 people. Now it's about 16,000, and it's owned by US Steel, but it's still the city's largest employer. And Košice has been known, really, for the past 50 years as the steel city. And clearly, there's a lot of people who would like to change that image, and Creative City has been mentioned as others. But as Tom mentioned, you can't just put the title there. It has to actually come from the grassroots. It has to mean something. And we'll be talking about that over the next 2 days. The Creative Economy Masterplan gave some strategies and many programs for how this process could begin, and some of them have already started. In terms of people working here, about 50% work in the service sector, 30% in industry, 12% in the public sector, 10% in education, and 10% in transport. And of the total workforce, 3% are in ICT, 2% scientific and technical activities, and 2% work in the arts, entertainment, and leisure. There hasn't been as much inward investment from foreign firms in this region as other parts of Slovakia, and that's another key issue. But the region does have the opportunity and access to structural EC funds, and that's a real opportunity. In my view, there's no shortage of potential money, investment money. The issue is finding the strategies, the programs, the projects that will actually attract the money. And support for research and development and innovation in the region is one of the key priorities of the city, the region, and the national government. And about 61% of expenditure for the sector is funded by the state, over 50 million euros a year. And there are over 5,000 people employed in R&D jobs across the region, the majority of them in technical sciences. But Košice needs to create more jobs from more companies, more projects, more foreign investment. It needs venture capital, more entrepreneurs, and more startups. And again, the Creative Economy Masterplan gave some ideas and strategies for that. And the cultural strategy that we're working on this year recommends the creation of a joined-up city incubator program that would be partly located here at Kasana, in one of the other buildings, and partly at Tabachka, which is an interdisciplinary independent cultural centre located in the city. Internet access here is great. About 80% of all households have access to good internet, and most cafes or bars in the city are wired up. You can get onto Wi-Fi. I recommend Tarantino's, and Mikhail and I will probably be there later on tonight having a drink if any of you want to join us. Unfortunately, many people I have met here have an ill issue with the political system in terms of the very heavy bureaucracy, lots of laws, lots of rules, very difficult to do things here. And you hear a lot of gossip about how things really work. And I often hear the phrase, "It's not possible, Paul, it's not possible." But having lived under martial law in Poland in the 1980s, I see that there is still a legacy in Slovakia, as with Poland and most of the former Eastern Bloc countries, of the nomenklatura system. It's not only hard to find out here and understand how things work, it's also hard to find out what is the truth about any particular issue. And everyone you talk to tells you something different. They tell you a different story or a different version of the same story. And getting rid of some of these rules which go back to a previous era, I think, is really important. And that brings me to the issue of collaboration and joint working. That, for me, is the key issue here, is the lack of collaboration and joint working that there's been in the past. And that's really across all areas, but particularly within the cultural sector. There has previously been very few partnerships, joint working, and there's a general mistrust between people, not wanting to give out information, suspicious of why you're asking questions. However, this year, Sandy Fitzgerald and myself are working on a project called Escalator. That's the Facebook page there. And it's supporting the development of 12 cultural organisations, projects, artists and startups. And the individuals we are working with from those 12 groups are all highly committed. They're also highly ambitious and highly talented. And they are potentially the city's future cultural leaders. And they are working together. They are collaborating. They are learning from each other. I'm realizing, as Charles Darwin said, that in the long history of humankind, and animal kind too, those who learnt to collaborate and improvise most effectively have prevailed. There's another good example, success of collaboration, just here on Kasana at the Steel Park Creative Factory, which is the building just over here. And it's an interactive science centre aimed at children. And it was funded through US Steel and by the city. And they brought together the 3 universities. And for the first time, scientists, artists, technicians and managers worked together to create some really exciting interactive exhibits. And if you're like me, a child at heart, I really strongly advise you to go over there if you can and play with the amazing exhibits which are of a scientific nature. But unfortunately, up until this year, there's been little or no professional development or capacity building within the cultural sector. Although most of the organisations this year and for the past few years have got project grants from the Ministry of Culture as part of the Capital of Culture project. But investing in people here is essential, and investing in the people here with talent, but also bringing other people into the region. So this year, a total of 16 million euros of revenue and project grants is being spent on culture in the city, from the state, from the region, and from the city. This doesn't include the infrastructure European Capital of Culture projects such as Kasana. But 93% of this 16 million is going to the state governmental organisations. And it's worth noting that 16 million of the funding this year is being spent in the city, that 4.5 million of it is just for the Capital of Culture programme and its management. The city of Košice, excluding the zoo, currently spends 2% of its total annual revenue budget on culture, excluding capital projects. And the new cultural strategy is proposing and asking that this should be increased to 3%. The figure of 3% is not so high either in real terms or compared to other cities around Europe. So if you look at cities around the same size of Košice, so examples would be Wolverhampton in the UK is 4%, Graz, Austria 5%, Lille in France 4%, and Krakow, which is obviously much bigger, but in Poland is 3%. Most of the public funding for the city's independent cultural organisations this year is coming from a special 1.7 million euro fund from the Ministry of Culture, specifically set up for Košice 2013. And this budget line won't exist next year. And without replacing some of this funding, it's questionable if many of the organisations and the events that have been created here over the past 3 years can survive. So finding some replacement to that funding, I feel, is critical if we're going to actually gain the momentum that's been built up in this year. There are about 150 cultural institutions, organisations and groups, either based in the city or serving the city. And 125 of them are either independent, NGOs or private. But this year they just share 7% of the total funding. And if you take away the culture capital funding, it's only 2% of the total. And this imbalance of funding between the state and non-state sector is similar in most, again, former Eastern Bloc countries. It's not particular to Slovakia or Košice. But it's a real problem because if you want to set up a new project, if you've got the ambition, if you've got the talent, the energy, it's really hard to access funding. And then quite often these people, they give up because they just can't pay the rent. So what's required? We need to develop new, sustainable and accessible support structures for the independent, private and non-governmental cultural sector, and for artists as well, and for local communities, as part of really smart cultural strategies. Because it's hard to see, if you don't do this, how the country, its regions and cities can achieve their cultural and creative ambitions. And in particular here in Košice, whose stated vision is to be an international centre of culture and tourism. Those of you who had a chance to walk around the centre of the city will have seen its fantastic architecture, its really deep heritage and great atmosphere. And if you come here in the summer, that whole central street is packed with outdoor cafes, loads of people, and a real vibe going on. It's really a nice place to be, one of the best main streets of a city I think I've been to in Europe. But last year, Košice region had only 280,000 overnight visitors. Not stays in rooms, but physical people. And that 280,000 compared to 1 million in Bratislava and an average of 400,000 in the 7 other regions of the country. But hopefully, because of European Capital of Culture, this year we'll see a marked increase in the number of visitors to the city and to the region. But there's still a lot more work to be done in terms of attracting tourists and also cultural tourists, and providing a higher level of customer care and other services. So one example is this year I've seen that most of the marketing and promotion material for cultural capital events has only been in Slovakia and isn't really geared up for the non-local market. And developing tourism and also cultural tourism is a priority for the region and the city. It's not particularly being assisted by the fact that there are 2 tourism offices, one run by the region and one a public-private partnership supported by the city, and no real combined tourism strategy. And if you're a tourist here, it's quite confusing because you've got 2 different offices to go to. And clearly, if it was possible, it would make much more sense to have one office come together and have just one tourism strategy. And this is going to be a recommendation, we hope, in the cultural strategy. The strategy also proposes, quite importantly, the establishment of a new city grants programme. This would be managed and have its applications assessed independently, and it will provide annual project and individual support for organisations, for groups, for artists and for individuals and communities. And its key objectives would be increasing capacity and investing in skills, developing the city's independent cultural sector, forging new partnerships across all sectors, nationally and internationally, increasing arts education provision, talent development, and increasing audiences and overall participation. At present in the country, again similarly to a lot of Eastern Europe, there's no real relationship between the amount of grants given to organisations and the outputs, the delivery, the quality. Many grants are given just for historical reasons, with no clear identification of why they're given, what for and for whom, and who the funding is actually for. And I say that situation is not unique to Slovakia. In a lot of the countries I've worked in this part of Europe, it's quite usual for state organisations to have 90% of their income from funding. And this usually results in what I call a culture of dependency, where the institutions are totally reliant on one single source of funding, and there's no incentive or reason for them to earn their own income, become more self-sufficient, change, or even increase their audiences. And the directors of these institutions will usually tell you that they don't have enough funding, that art is not a product, and low audience levels are because people just don't understand the art. But the proposed new city grant programme will require recipients to sign up to and deliver measurable results based on service level agreements and contracts that will be closely monitored by a new city cultural development agency who would have responsibility for managing the grants programme and coordinating the implementation of the culture strategy. But its primary objective will be to foster, nurture and support collaboration internally and externally across the city's cultural providers, building trust and joined-up working and cost-effectiveness between the public, NGO and commercial cultural sectors, between artists and organisations, between the city's culture, business and education sectors, and between citizens and cultural providers, so that everyone works together in the city, so that everyone can take part in it. Thank you.